Hello, everybody. Let's try again. We seem to have had some kind of technical problem there with the show. Probably my fault or our fault. We're not quite sure, but we're going to try again. I think we had a problem that we thought that probably we were only broadcasting to friends rather than everybody. So my apologies to everybody for not recording or not being allowed to be seeing the things we were just discussing, but we will try and recreate. My guest and myself, Thomas Sheridan and myself, we're both fairly creative individuals, so I'm sure that we can recreate what we were doing before. Just to quickly explain, today's guest is a gentleman called Thomas Sheridan. Thomas and I have met on a couple of occasions when we've been doing events in the past. And again, it's quite unusual in my life. When you meet somebody that you immediately have an affinity to, you chat about things and, right, so we've gone back to friends, apparently. Right. Okay. I'm going to continue with this for now because we can't continue this. We're going to have to try and sort it out in the future. It seems that Facebook keeps defaulting back to friends when we're trying to allow everybody to view it. So we're going to try and see if we can sort this out in the future. I might try and see if I can work out this while we're going live, while Thomas is chatting about various things. But just to tell you a little bit about Thomas Sheridan. Thomas Sheridan is an author, artist and filmmaker from Dublin, Ireland, who came to international recognition in 2011 with his book Puzzling People, The Labyrinth of the Psychopath. In recent times, his work has been featured in some of the world's largest media outlets as the interest on his work, serial killers, occult history and mind control cults continues to grow and has resulted in Thomas Sheridan becoming a much sought after public speaker due to his entertaining, if at times hilariously funny information style of presentation. Sheridan offers a holistic approach to all the topics he covers, believing that by re-examining everything from art to mythology to the occult and on social engineering, that this can equip us with what he terms a consciousness firewall in the face of pathological forces. His mantra, "Feck them if they can't take a joke," has become a clarion call for others to never allow the dark forces of this world to wash over us, as well as never take ourselves or what we believe in too seriously. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Great to be back here, Anthony and Sarah, or well, here again. And,
again, it's like the eternal return, isn't it?
I know it's like we're having a deja vu in real time.
But it is, isn't it? I mean, one of the things I really love about your image in the background is seeing Sigiriya, which is one of my favorite places on the planet. It's really quite unbelievable location down there in Sri Lanka. Very quickly, one of the things we were discussing before, and we'll pick up on again now, is I've been rereading this incredible book here. It is Defeating Demons, and it is the most extraordinary book. And Thomas, I'd like you, if you can, to tell us a little bit about this book and a little bit about the background, because before you were really on fire describing it. So if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Well, that book was basically what didn't make it into Puzzling People. And there was, the first book, Puzzling People, would have been like 700 pages long if it had went out the original manuscript. So myself and the publishers at the time decided to split it down into two. And that was the second part of it. And so it did have some overlap with the original one, but it carried on with a lot more of an insight into things like the spiritual elements of it. Became more of a discourse on pathology and evil and the effects on humanity and the world. So I was able to bring a lot more freedom into it in terms of the spiritual aspect of it. So there's strong references to things like paganism and Vedic philosophy and stuff like that. And it became the sort of like the bookend of that period of my life when basically I'd been introduced to the world. Before I made Puzzling People, I was just a nobody on YouTube, just making videos and about these topics, because I used to work on Wall Street as a graphic designer and a communications consultant. I wasn't a money man. And so it was about like trying to rationalize people I'd met through there and experiences. And that I've been reading for years. How that first started was I was reading about serial killers one day at work. I don't know who it was, but it was a criminal profiling of serial killers. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, and I started to put these guys are serial killers, except they don't actually kill anybody. What they do is they create hedge funds and corporate hostile takeovers and destroy third world countries to grab their infrastructure and resources. And that's where it all began, and as a kind of like a hobby from that point on. So by the time I was making these videos as nobody on YouTube, about 2008, 9, yeah, around 2009, somebody saw them and says, would you write some books for us? And that's how that started. And I didn't think it'd go anywhere, but it gave me a career as a writer, and let me do all the other things I'm interested in from that. But it gave me a profile. But so that was that was almost like an experience of years of notes, of taking notes on situations in my own life, people I dealt with that I couldn't understand. Like, what the hell was that? This kind of moment. And Robert Hare's book Without Conscience was a huge influence for me. It was the first real proper clinical study of psychopathology in both men, but not so much in women, but mostly in men. But he did do women as well. And it was like, that was it. He finally nailed it. But I thought there was a space for a layman's book on it, because if this information is too important and too vital for the majority of people not to know. So that was puzzling people as a handbook, like, get the information out there without too much science, without too much gobbledygook, without too much word salad, and just tear right into the heart of the matter. And so puzzling people was the handbook, and then Defeated Demons could be seen as the deeper dive. And then I brought in the socio-political element of that as well, and the cultural elements.
Well, I found it absolutely fascinating, particularly when I was rereading it a couple of days ago, because many years ago, I came across a character that I would think would be considered to be by your good self as being probably a classical psychopath. And it was in a party in South London around about mainly 30 years ago now. And I was introduced to somebody at the party. And this guy engaged with me. He was highly intelligent. And I felt he was evaluating me all the time. But the thing that really intrigued me was his eyes were dead. There was something, there was no light behind them in some way. And I found that extraordinarily disturbing. And later on, the next morning, when I got up and I was chatting to the host was on the periphery of the gangster scene in South London at the time. It shows the kind of world I was living in at the time, I suppose, as well. And I said to him, the guy that he introduced me to, there was something not quite right about him. And he said, yes, I'm sorry about that. I should have prepared you. His nickname is the Burner. And I said, why do they call him the Burner? And he said, because that's what he does. He is employed by various gangs in South London, and there's various lockup garages, and he tortures people to death in them, and he uses a blowtorch. And I thought, oh my God, this is just extraordinarily awful to discover something like this. So clearly there's something, we can pick up these nuances, can't we? And sometimes it's in the eyes. What are your thoughts on that? Is there any neurological evidence for such a thing?
Oh, the eyes thing is the best giveaway of all, the dead eyes. Very important, that one. Now, before I say this, I have as all this work I've done on those two books. Don't go around evaluating everyone or someone who pissed you off in real life and calling them a psychopath. They're the 1% of society, and there's a good chance that many of us will go through life and never ever meet one. I hope you're that fortunate. But the dead eyes is a total giveaway. What happens is their frontal cortex is basically switched off. It's not damaged now. It's switched off, and that's the area where we process compassion, dreaming, imagination, creativity. And if you put them under an fMRI scanner, there's almost nothing happens there, nothing. And the back of their brain, where the reptilian cortex is, on the other side of the amygdala, is like firing up. So they live in a reptilian brain, the lower primitive brain stem. Now, the wide predatory eyes is caused by an overproduction of norepinephrine, the fight or flight hormone that comes out the lower brainstem, the top of the spinal column, which just so happens to be, and maybe this could be an evolutionary thing that for us to actually recognize them, is the nerves go from the eyes to the optical cortex at the same part of the back of the brain. So when it floods with norepinephrine, the eyes open up like a python or a boa about to attack. That look, and also the grin, the smirk, it kind of like that duper's delight smirk is also seems to be connected to that as well. This kind of thing, you'll see that a lot of politicians are, kind of like this, the shifty secondhand car salesman. Oh, sure, it's a great car, that kind of thing. That seems to be related to it as well. But actually, having said that, I had a friend. He's dead now. He died now, sadly. He had eyes that were like that, but he had a motorcycle accident when he was younger, so it damaged him. So that's why it's important not to go through life, judge them on their whole life story, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, this was to me the first book was a survival manual. Is basically a way to deal with it. But there's also another aspect to it, the proto-psychopath, which is the individual who's not born a natural born one, and doesn't, and they've been made that way through war, maybe an abusive home. And like I was saying, classic examples of that would be Fred and Rosemary West. Rosemary was absolutely the psychopath, but Fred wasn't. Fred was a proto, and he's made away from a brutal background, and then she seemed to have nurtured him and made him constantly worse. And that's why he killed himself when she grassed out on him into the police in the station. At some level, as bizarre as it seems, Fred West genuinely loved Rosemary West. And a psychopath is not capable of love, so you could tell who the one in that one was. And the same thing happened with Maura Hindley and Ian Brady. Ian Brady was the psychopath, and she was the proto. She had a brutal childhood, incest, alcoholism, violence, and he took her under his wing. And he was a very strange character. We know he was born in Glasgow, but we don't really know his family background. And I was talking to people who were in the court when he was being. This is what's the great thing about yourself writing books. You get to interview, you find people to interview with these historic characters. That was actually in one of the retrials for the Moors murderers, and he said Brady carried himself like an aristocrat. So, but he said just the coldness of him was when he walked into the courtroom, there was this, and people, by that time people already knew his reputation, but he said it was a sense of coldness just filled the air, a kind of business-like coldness.
That is intriguing, isn't it? The idea that we can sense in some subliminal level these people. Because again, when you were mentioning the reptilian brain, as I remember, it was MacLean, wasn't it, that came up with the triune brain theory? And of course, we could extrapolate from here to the idea of the reptilians and the David Icke stuff, but we don't need to go that far. We're talking here about known neurology. We know how the brain is structured. We know there's a reptilian brain, and then wrapped around that is the mammalian brain, and then the cerebral cortex on the top. So but this is
interject that. Sorry, we shouldn't discount that stuff either, because I'm actually a belief that the actual underlying consciousness is the issue. Your brain is just a machine. Neurology is just a machine. There's a consciousness underneath there that's non-local to it and operates through the brain structure. I believe that in the pure psychopathic individuals, there is definitely a non-human consciousness in there. I don't know what it is. You can call it a reptilian, you can call it an archon, a jinn, anything you want, a demon. But if there's one thing I'm absolutely certain about, it is not a human being behind there.
Yeah, this is interesting. And I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read my latest book, The Hidden Universe, but I'm coming up with a concept I'm calling the egregorial. And again, from the neurology and the neurochemistry, there clearly does seem to be something that can be generated by the human mind that is alien to the human mind, the concept of the other, the idea that there is an other. And of course, if we then extrapolate this into multiple personality syndrome, dissociative personality syndrome, we do find that these manifestations can take place. And earlier on, you referenced, the concept of the jinn and everything else as well. These all seem to have echoes of themselves in some way. And let's return to this later, because I think it's a fascinating topic. And I think it's one that we both have mutual interests in, I think. But one of the things that I'd like to get started with really is something that we're both interested in. The way in which it seems that modern science and cutting edge science seems to know an awful lot about quantum theory and cosmology, but they don't seem to take the implications seriously enough. At the moment, I'm doing some research into the holographic nature of the universe and the way in which the things that are being discovered about black holes, so it's suggested that this is digital and it's informational. So the question is, why do you think this is? And are these fields important? And why is it that modern science seems to be going so far with the implications, but no more? Is there a fear? Is it something more?
I think there's also an underlying thing they don't actually believe it somehow. It's almost like you could be a member of a certain religion and you could learn about another religion and say that's very interesting, but you don't believe in it. It's almost like that. And there was an article the other day in The Guardian about some woman who's writing a book on 3D quantum computing, and it was the article was pure guff. It was terrible. It was absolutely horrible, and it was like didn't explain anything. And then it didn't really make any points of that were nothing we knew that we'd heard from the 80s. And it didn't really convince me on any level. And I'm like thinking to myself, that's because they don't know. And
Yeah,
then,
I saw exactly that article. Now I had exactly the same reaction as you had.
and then there's kind of like platitude at the end to like how important it is to have women in science. No,
Yeah,
they have,
yeah.
okay, fair enough. We want to know about quantum 3D computing, but it's very typical Guardian. But the like, I mean, I have a friend who's a top end geneticist at Trinity College in Dublin, and he thinks that it's a load of guff, quantum mechanics and quantum theory. And I ask him why, and he goes, "Well, he's a very much a materialistic guy. He can't." He said it's all theory, and I said, "Well, so is a lot of genetics," and he gets all angry and stuff like that. And I said, "Does it? They go so, it all has to start somewhere, and the thing with the quantum theories and the quantum, particle theoretical physics in that regard is there's not a responsibility, like you said, going forward. I mean, I remember I was way back in the 90s or maybe the late 80s. Omni magazine had an article by a cosmologist who said that we're probably destroying the universe by observing it so deeply that we're actually seeing the universe before it manifests. And our assumptions are probably creating this material universe we live in prior to its manifestation within the quantum world. So, for instance, if we have something like a Hubble telescope and we're looking at the very edges of space, the very edge, we're seeing the creation of the universe in real time. It's the observer effect. As you know yourself, and what assumptions we have about both the universe and ourselves will be hardwired into the manifestation of that creative force as it spools from the outer fringes of the universe and into us. Now, this is powerful stuff.
Mm.
By extension, you have the concept of then peering into the mechanics of the building blocks of the universe. Same thing, really. When you're looking deep into the CERN, looking for the Higgs boson thing, did they actually find Higgs boson, or was it manifested by a desire, a need to find the God particle? You see, there's an element of, there's almost like a creative force then comes into play, where the ones who hold the cards in this game are the ones who can create the reality going forward. And I find that a little bit frightening, and especially if we have like pathological forces in charge of this planet, and they can decide, well, here's the kind of reality we're going to have, being aware that it's created by the observation of the far out reaches of the universe and the interior of the inner universe. Well, we have to make sure that there's some, we have statutes on human rights. Maybe it's now time to have a kind of a moratorium on the cutting edges of theoretical physics and cosmology, because the world has become very strange in recent years, and space has become very strange in recent years, and I'm not fully convinced that that is not a byproduct of human consciousness and human thought. And that's why I think they're diving straight into it, just like they dived into the atomic bomb and everything else. And this could be basically, there could be destroying the universe.
You're spot on there. I made the point before about the egregorial, and the new book I'm writing at the moment will be developing the egregorial further to the idea that the act of observation or the act of expectation creates the world around us. And your point there is profoundly valid, that if you're looking for things, you're going to find them. And I've quoted now, I think, on about 3 or 4 occasions in this show, the famous quote by Isambard Rabi, when they discovered the muon, when he turned around and he said, "Who ordered that?" And indeed, only this morning, I've written a section on my new book on the Planck constant and the way in which Max Planck's act of desperation in 1900, where he literally plugged a number, almost number at random, in, and this constant number is then reoccurring throughout quantum physics and indeed within cosmology. So it seems to me as if the scientists themselves are creating the world around them by their expectations of what they're going to find. Now, your point here is a profoundly valid one, isn't it? Who is doing the observing here? And if there's a certain type of person doing the observing, it's creating the universe in a specific way. And of course, the final point here is the idea that we can create not only the universe as it is now, but as it was in the distant past. Because of course, you look at the work of John Wheeler and the way in which Wheeler called it the anticipatory universe and the participatory universe, in the way in which we collapse the wave function of incidents that took place deep in the past. Now, clearly, this means the one-to-one relationship between what we are and what the external world is far closer. And I think your point there is powerfully valid, isn't it? I mean, it's going back almost to the occult law of years ago and occult science, people like Jack Parsons and other people, and going back even to John, to Dee and everybody else, the idea of bringing the reality in and controlling the entities that you pull through. And I think in this kind of idea, we can then move on to this, can't we? The whole thing of alchemy, the relationship between the occult and science, and exactly what we mean when we say that these things are related in one way or another. The floor is yours, Thomas.
Well, I was talking to someone the other day about this, and I was having difficulty trying to get the point across to them. And I said, well, think of it as a kind of a quantum insider trading, that they know the deals before the rest is given to us. So if you have a pathological force that's actually has the first observational records of what comes through the Hubble telescope or some powerful radio telescope or from a hadron collider, they can actually usurp reality before they give it to us. So they explain to us, oh, we saw this, and it may be something that could benefit them that they've seen that doesn't benefit us. So it's sort of like become a gangster kind of thing within this. You see, that anytime there's a chance to for power over others, and what's the ultimate power? The creation of the universe and the creation of the material world that we live in. And this would give these individuals tremendous power. So it's almost like a type of insider trading where they got the info before anyone else. And so this is why we have to be really careful of this. Now, how this ties into the occult, well, it's massively part of it. I mean, I think it was Crowley who said that, scientists are constantly discovering little bits of magic and thinking they're very clever. And that's absolutely true. I mean, magic is the uncharted territory of science. It's out there, but they don't have the map to it. Where the individual, the people who practice these things, even artists especially, and even many of us, like Crowley said, we're all creating bits of magic every day. We just don't realize it. So you better learn how to do it. He was saying exactly, do it properly. He was saying exactly the same thing, the generation of reality. In fact, when I was making the Jack Parsons documentary, I went back and read Crowley's novel Moonchild. And I was quite amazed to see how he was pushing all things like the multiverse idea, theoretical physics, the early days of quantum physics, through his novel as part of the plot line. So he was acutely aware of the scientific advances of the day. That's probably what brought him to Jack Parsons anyway. That's probably what enamored him with him. But people don't realize that the likes of Crowley and John Dee and Edward Kelly and particularly Parsons, and William S. Burroughs as well, these guys who are involved in the occult were also very heavily involved in science and reading the latest scientific papers and quantifying their own work towards what was happening and things like that. And this is one of the great tragedies of the scientific method, although it's brought us sort of like a refinement of the mechanisms of creating things in terms of machines and stuff like that and actual produce. It has robbed imagination out of a lot of science. And this is to the point where, you go onto any group and you mention that Isaac Newton was just as much an alchemist as he was a physicist or a mathematician or an astronomer. And they go, oh no, it was just a little thing he did on the side. And they get very angry if you point out that, there are reams and reams of volumes more of his occult work than there is of his actual, Principia Mathematica. Oh, it's almost like a hostile reaction. And I want to know why that hostile reaction exists. That's quite simple. It's the same reason the church burned witches and druids in the past and shamans. Is because they know that anyone who has an insight into this stuff has that ability to get there ahead of them or get there at the same time as them. And so this is why, particularly after the rise of Christianity, all these groups like the Druids and stuff went underground and became Freemasons and things like this. And or else they remained in the system as as open kind of like science, natural philosophers, they used to call them. But yeah, I mean, they will never escape that ever. They will never escape the occult in the truest sense, the unknown, and the blank canvas of unmanifested reality. It's accessible to people through heightened senses of concentration and extreme attenuation and focus of their nervous system. It can be done. We've all done it accidentally or purposefully in our life. Your books is full of stories like that. And my attitude is, if we're not creating this for ourselves, they're going to create it on our behalf.
Very, very good point. Could you explain a little bit about Jack Parsons for the people watching here as to exactly who Jack Parsons was, because he was a fascinating guy, and maybe a little bit of even about Crowley, some of the characters you mentioned there. Can you just put a little bit of meat on the bone?
Well, Jack Parsons was an American rocket engineer who was born in Los Angeles back in 1940, before World War I started. And from an early childhood, he had two fascinations: rockets and science fiction. And he grew up in a wealthy family that lost all their money in the Great Depression. And from the time he was a young kid, him and a good friend of his called Ed Foreman, they were building rockets and testing rocket fuels to try and get into space. And what the impetus for this was, they were both science fiction fans. Now, you see, this is kind of interesting because those science fiction stories were grimoires. They were almost like magical desires. And they were saying, how do we manifest? How does him and his 10-year-old friend get into space, like in the science fiction stories? Well, let's build the rockets. And that's, they were starting to do complex, these were just ordinary kids, complex things on measuring chemical combustion rates, velocity, escape speeds, and everything from a very early age. They were blowing up rockets over Pasadena. And this is the beginning of NASA, two 10-year-old boys launching rockets. So they went through life, and they started getting more serious about it. Parsons couldn't go to Caltech because his family lost all their money in the Depression, so he was poor. But through an individual called Theodore von Karman, who was a professor, a Hungarian professor at Caltech, he was also the descendant of the famous Rabbi Lode, who brought the golem of Prague into creation. Him and Parsons clicked it off like that. And there's also a Kelly connection there too as well, because Kelly worked for Rudolph II of Bohemia as well. And so he arranged to have him test his rockets even though he wasn't a student at Caltech. And eventually they developed the very first thing, which was a thing called the Jato rocket, which is a jet-assisted takeoff, small rocket put on aircraft to take them off short runways or off aircraft carriers. It was the very first rocket ever commissioned by a government. And Jack Parsons and his Ed Foreman did that from science fiction stories as kids. At the same time, they both developed, particularly Parsons, an interest in the occult after coming across the work of Crowley. And Parsons then realized through his interest in quantum physics and quantum theory and magic that he could actually help develop the American space program and his own interest in rockets. So he'd be sitting there while they'd be testing rockets in the Mojave Desert, and he'd be rattling off, verses from Crowley's magic texts. And people like Frank Nalini, who went on to be a famous NASA scientist, and Theodore von Karman and Caltech, we all laughing around them. They came across it, they thought it was a bit of fun, a bit of laugh. But he actually went, and also he was also in contact with Werner von Braun, who was the German rocket scientist, eventually became the father of Apollo. And he was also, believe it or not, inspired by science fiction. So the science fiction was they talk about, Crowley said, what's magic? The art and science of creating change in the material world. Well, Parsons absolutely represented that. You have the art of science fiction, the will, the concentration, and then you have the science, which was the actual building the rockets. It won't happen by itself. It won't you can't just sit there and go abracadabra and it happens. You have to take, yourself one step forward in the universe and it'll take 2 steps towards you, this kind of thing. And he went on to basically, he basically founded the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is euphemistically and jokingly called the Jack Parsons Lab. And he found the aerospace company, which is still there today. And sadly, in the early 1950s, after a ritual he performed with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. It's just incredible. You couldn't make a story up. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, they've created a thing called, they wanted to create a moonchild using, as I was talking about earlier on, Crowley's grim book as a grimoire, because they started to understand that literature and art are more than just, especially in the growing pop culture world, these things are incredibly powerful. These are not just songs or stories or movies. These things have an actual ability to change reality if you actually concentrate upon them and use as part of your magical workings. So they went in, and amazingly, they went into the desert, the Mojave Desert, to do this ritual. Well, they did it in the Parsonage, which was a lodge in South Pasadena. And then they went out after it was ended, and Parsons just said to Hubbard, it's come to pass. And at that moment, a woman called Marjorie Cameron knocked on the door of the Lodge of Pasadena, and that was the sacred Babylonian horror that the thing was to bring into generation. She's also an amazing woman in herself. She was one of the first people in the United States to report the sighting of a UFO, and he went back and they became a couple, and it then went on from that. Hubbard went off to form Scientology and write Dianetics, and Parsons unfortunately died a few years later. He was probably murdered because he had too many secrets the FBI didn't want foreign governments having. But you couldn't make the story up. Now, talking about when he was back at Caltech first making the rockets, him and Frank Molina, a PhD student there, wrote a science fiction novel where they wrote themselves into the novel in the future. So they would be in the future, they'd build rockets that would bring peace to the world and be kind of like a pseudo-communist world where everyone had everything. But interestingly, Parsons wrote his character in the story as being blown up by one of his own rockets. And that's exactly what happened to Parsons. You can see it all in the documentary Liber Velocity, which I made, but with Jason Robin, my colleague. But you could not make this story up.
Because it's extraordinary there. Some of the people you're mentioning, and Paul Moran, one of the people in the chat room, has said, does Thomas think Parsons blew himself up accidentally? Which effectively you've just answered. But I'd like to follow the theme through here about the links between Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. I was aware to a certain extent about this. So it then feeds into Scientology, doesn't it? And of course, L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer, and of course, Dianetics has very much science fiction themes. So please continue with this whole theme, because we haven't touched upon Robert Oppenheimer, Vedic philosophy, various other things here. So you've just touched upon the surface. So please continue, because I'm fascinated by this.
Well, it's one of these things that if it was a movie made about it, you'd say to yourself, that's ridiculous. That could have never happened. And yet it did. In the post-World War II period in the United States, there was all people who came out of things like the Navy and the Air Force that had very good technical training and all these kinds of other things. And they found themselves in an America that was now in peacetime, but yet they had been changed profoundly by the war. Not just the actual war experience themselves, but many had been given good educations in technical issues and in military, and also traveled extensively. So they'd seen a lot of the world, while Americans were locked at home for 10 years because of the war, basically. And so ordinary American civilians. So anyway, this L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer who came out of the U.S. Navy, and he came out of the U.S. Navy, and science fiction novels aren't bad. They're mostly stories that were published in magazines like Weird Tales, like the classic, periodicals that would have like, H.P. Lovecraft stories and that kind of Charles Asimov stories in them. And he was basically, his marriage was ending, and he went from Seattle down to California and found about this place where they were called the Parsonage. It was the Agape Lodge of the OTO, and where what's his name is now the head, Jack Parsons. He knocked on the door and he asked could he park his trailer outside. And the minute him and Parsons met each other, the two of them just like gone on like a house on fire. They were spending hours and hours talking about everything from science to magic. And if you see Parsons' letters back to Crowley and the OTO in England about their meeting, he's saying Jack Parsons is an amazing character. Hubbard is an amazing character. He's not a trained magician, but he fully understands how it all works from his own writings and novels. And he's traveled extensively, so he's met, shamans and all this kind of thing around the world in the U.S. Navy. And the two of them became best friends. I mean, they were practically inseparable brothers. But then the woman issue came problem starts, you know, as usual. Jack Parsons was with a young girl called Sarah Northrup. Sarah Northrup was the sister of his previous wife, Helen Northrup. And their marriage kind of fell apart, although they remained friends. And Jack Parsons, to his credit, this comes up all time and time again, his decency, he continued to look after Sarah Northrup, her husband, and their kid, even though it wasn't his kid, with the money he was making from the Aerojet company. You know, so this decency comes up over and over again. So Sarah Northrup, basically there was a lot of sex magic going on in this place anyway. But Parsons was, you know, he was good looking and handsome, and he looked like a movie star. So all the girls were loving him. But he was devoted to this one girl called Sarah Northrup. He was completely in love with her. Beautiful, like classic California beauty, blonde type thing. Well, Hubbard went in there, and she immediately fell for Hubbard because he was a great talker, a great charmer. He was, you know, a very dynamic personality. He was great fun. And Parsons was actually very upset by it. There was two things. He genuinely, he lost the girl he loved. That was painful. You know, it was painful. At the same time, too, he didn't want to lose his friendship. This is how he was very loyal to his friends, you know, all his life. He didn't want to lose this friendship he had with L. Ron Hubbard. So he actually tried to hex the pain and suffering and jealousy and anger and everything out of himself by doing these. He started to return into European black magic and European occultism and witchcraft in the parsonage. And there was all these reports of banshee. Ed Norton opened the windows one night. There was a banshee screaming outside the window. There was orbs of light flying around, poltergeist activity, but it worked because after Parsons emerged from it, he was like, okay, I'm over that. That breakup is now over. He used the magic to help him deal with the breakup. It was almost like a magical flagellation type thing, you know. And so him and Hubbard then decided to do the Babylon working. The Babylon working was to create, is the ultimate kind of magical ritual. It was to create a child that was actually a product of reality rather than of biology. So it would be almost like a psychic force to change the world. And they were very idealistic. We could stop world. They both seen the horrors of World War II. We could stop all that. We could concentrate humanity onto getting into space and getting to stars and exploring our consciousness, exploring our universe and all this stuff. And so they devised the Babylon working, which was basically a mixture of various Crowley type rituals coupled with like venerate, a lot of paganism in there as well, particularly Egyptian magic, Hermeticism. And the ritual was designed in this way, and immediately strange, you know, and it was Parsons who was sort of the daddy of it, the main one, and Hubbard was the scribe. But as the thing progressed over a number of days, it changed. Now and then they started to. The idea was to hack reality, to change reality, and to produce a woman who would be the sacred whore of Babylon. She would come along, and then she would give birth to the symbolic moonchild, which would be her womb wouldn't actually produce a baby. It would produce an energetic change in humanity to make the world a better place. And this woman, amazingly, Marjorie Cameron, knocks on the door at the moment that Hubbard had been told by Parsons it worked. It worked. And so her and Parsons became a very happily married couple, which is kind of a tragic story that, you know, he finally found love and then he dies. But she said 9 years later, that she did actually give birth to the moonchild. She felt the manifestation happening right on the cusp of the 60s, the hippies and all that stuff. And so it did kind of happen, you know. And she can actually see her in Kenneth Anger's film Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, where she plays the goddess Kali. And it was just an amazing time in Hollywood and the cult down there. But then what happened was the Sarah Northrup thing became very iffy between the two guys, you know. And what happened was, now, history generally records Hubbard as the bad guy, but I think it was Sarah Northrup. And myself and Jason, when researching for the film, came to the conclusion that Sarah Northrup was probably the one who probably caused the schism deliberately as a power thing, or maybe, who knows, she could have been working for somebody. She and Hubbard approached Parsons about a business idea. They said, look, there's loads of luxury yachts in Miami. There's loads of customers in Hollywood that don't want yachts but can't get them. Why don't we buy yachts in Hollywood? We sail them through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Panama Canal, and sell them at a huge profit in Hollywood. And it was sound like a great idea. As soon as they arrived in Miami, they ran off with his money. They ran off with the money. Now, Parsons did a magical ritual to turn the seas against them, and it worked. The yacht that they were on was crashed in a sudden freak storm, and the U.S. Coast Guard picked them up and brought them into U.S. custody. So the magical ritual worked, but he'd lost all the money by then. He got something back. But the whole thing was that they tried to make out that Hubbard alone was the scoundrel who ran with the money. But when you look more and more into it, and Sarah Northrop seems to have been the one who probably Hubbard was fixated with Northrop. She could, a very crude expression, pussy whipped. It was like that kind of thing, but that was basically what was going on, and you do know the thing in magic of the wine of Venus, where a woman can completely control a man by sneaking her menstrual blood into his food or into his drink. And there's a belief that's out there streaming around that she may have done that to both of them. Hence why Parsons took the breakup so bad, and hence why Hubbard ran off with his friend's money. Now, I know Hubbard had an interesting, we tried to write the story, not knowing what we know about Scientology and Hubbard now, with all this overcoating and all this just as it was at the time it was happening in the 1940s. That's when we wrote it, as if we didn't know about Scientology, we didn't know about any of that stuff. Just as it was, we transformed ourselves, and we came increasingly to the conclusion that she did it. She was the culprit, and when she eventually married Hubbard and tried to take his money when they broke up, she was the one who created the whole myth of Hubbard being a monster, in a very nasty divorce settlement. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But I've read Dianetics and I've looked into Hubbard's early, and there was almost like two Ron Hubbards. One before he met her, dynamic and fascinating. Before he read, actually, and then he wrote Dianetics right after. Say before Dianetics writing, and then something happened right after the Dianetics. Almost like I said, dissociation. His brain changed, or he was maybe killed and replaced by someone else, a Manchurian or something like that. The CIA very heavily involved in anything to do with these kinds of religious movements, whatever. But there's no doubting that Hubbard in his early days, forget everything about Scientology, forget all the stuff you hear about that, was a remarkable character. And in many ways, Scientology, Dianetics was basically based on what the magical stuff that had come out of like Crowley magic and things like that.
Yeah, very much so. The concept of the operating thetan and everything else as well. It was very, very intriguing. And indeed, 2 years ago, I spent some time at Saint Hill Manor, nearby where I normally live, rather than the location I am today. And it was quite intriguing listening into that. And when I was at university, I did a course on the sociology of religion, and one of the modern cults that we followed and discussed in detail was Scientology. And I've always felt that L. Ron Hubbard was a curious character. Also, we then have the edging into the world of Philip K. Dick here, because I know that Philip K. Dick and L. Ron Hubbard met each other as well. But what I'd like to do now quickly is, because I know there were one or two things you probably said there that would fascinate Sarah. So Sarah, would you like to come in with any comments or questions now?
Yeah, I was very interested in what you were saying first off about psychopaths and childhood trauma, because I know that even childhood neglect can lead to brain damage. So certain areas of your brain don't develop or become as large as they might do if you have a normal upbringing and childhood. And it's interesting actually what you were saying with regard to that in terms of this relationship trauma that obviously occurred between Hubbard and Northrop. And I think I read somewhere once that when couples split up, the man often takes it harder because they weren't anticipating it, and that men can experience breakups as almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards, whereas women tend to be making assessments of the relationship as they're going along. And so often it affects men more deeply. And interesting that Hubbard then had this kind of shift into, you know, the character that he becomes later on once he becomes the head of Scientology. But was Sarah involved in setting up Scientology as well?
Yeah, well, she was, and she was very heavily involved in the writing of Dianetics. Not, you know, not, she was there. She was in the midst of all that stuff. I mean, I would encourage people to forget all the stereotypes you've heard about Scientology and read Dianetics. You'll be surprised at the level of wisdom actually in that book. You know, it's got a kind of a bad name, but there's definitely many morsels of great tangents of discovery inside that I found anyway. But yeah, I think so. That's interesting about men breaking up. The reason why men don't break up is because men aren't taught about these things. A woman will process, you know, men don't listen to love songs the same way a woman does, I don't think. I think a woman will more likely throw herself into the words of the love song, where a man will just like the melody. I'm not trying to be stereotypical here, but that's just my experience. Women are better at handling those kinds of emotional things much better. Men don't think they're ever going to have a broken heart, and when they do, they've like landed on an alien planet, and and they're just not equipped to survive. And I think that's why they take it so badly. In fact, that's interesting too, because it's happened to all of us. I mean, a state of dissociation goes into you almost, and you can see why. You know, hear stories of like fellas who were like lovely and all happy and peachy keen and bright eyes and bushy tail and
stuff. Oh, I know so many of them.
Until someone broke their heart, and he became cold and hard, and you know, went on to devote his life to his career and stuff like that. It happens. Why? Well, because you know, he didn't think he was gonna. I mean, men are not told that that's going to happen to them. They're going to fall that deeply in. It doesn't happen to them. And when it happens to them, they're almost like shocked. And it's like, what's this feeling I'm having? You know, where a woman is prepared for it. And also the hormonal differences are very different. Women have the hormones to create children and to menstruate, and they're very powerfully hormonal. Where men are a man's needs are very simple. You know, very, very simple. A man's needs are very simple, because where a woman's far more there's a greater complexity, and that complexity, I think, aids healing in traumas like that, I think.
Well, I think there is definitely a parallel there with the kind of dissociative identity disorder that you have, where you create an alter, where you go through so much shock that you almost split off and form this different personality. And I think that can happen to men because, you know, exactly what you were saying, this paper I was reading about men processing breakups said that they experience it as this incredible body shock in a way that women kind of know it's coming.
Yeah, it's funny. And also men are useless at picking up on what's coming down the road. They're useless at it. I'm completely useless at that. Where, you know, like, you know, where a woman, you know, I mean, I saw a joke where it's quite blasphemous, but it's funny, where Mary Magdalene is talking to Jesus after he came back from the dead, and she's going, "So, you just died for 3 days, really?" You know, this kind of thing, like Colin was implying that he was with another woman or something, and where a man, you know, like a man has to practically see the woman walking down the aisle with the guy before he realizes, oh, she likes him. You know? Like, men are clueless. We're absolutely clueless at that level. I think women are more like future orientated, where men are probably in the present. And
probably why so many women were involved in divination in the ancient cultures.
Oh, big time. The oracles of Delphi and the Vestal Virgins, the vestiges of ancient Rome. And we now know, well, we've always known it. In Ireland, we always knew it, that there was just as many druids as female druids as there was males. And that, you know, so this kind of thing. About the dissociation thing in certain personality disorders, I was speaking to someone who worked in a psychiatric hospital in the US, and they were telling me that there's a new theory on borderline personality. This is the one where it generally affects women, mostly, almost exclusively, but it does affect some men. But it's a terror and a fear of abandonment, and this terror of abandonment makes them basically live in a state of, you know, crisis, smear campaigns against their exes. They destroy their own lives with it, this kind of thing. And the theory is that as young infants, something happened where the mother's connection to the baby was broken. So she's holding the infant there, and the husband has a row, and she goes, "Don't you, talk to me like that." The baby's primitive consciousness can't rationalize what the mother's doing, and thinks the mother's talking to the baby. And that's when something happens and their brain literally explodes. And that's where the borderline state comes in, and they spend the rest of their lives in terror of abandonment because they think the mother at that state was abandoning them. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, because I find that very interesting. The discussion here and the direction it's going, which is really interesting, was the way in which we deal as different sexes with not being able to see the problems coming down the road. And that is very interesting, isn't it? So it's almost an extrapolation from, was it Women Are From Venus and Men Are From Mars, which was very, very popular many years ago. But it does sometimes show how we can misunderstand each other because of this, because of the way we're thinking and anticipating. And I do find that very intriguing. There's a whole theme that we could jump onto there in general terms, but I'm wanting to just pull it back for now before we move out into the general area, because one of the areas that, as my background is partially as an art historian, one of the things I've always been interested in is the role of art in the generation of reality. We were talking before about the way in which subatomic particles can be brought into existence by the act of observation, or the waveform is collapsed by the act of observation. The same thing in many ways. We build our world by imagery. We build our world by art, right from the original cave paintings going right through to modern pop culture. Now, I know this is an area that really interests you in the sense of how popular culture molds the universe we're within. So maybe we can chat about this for a little bit.
Well, I mean, this is a colossal subject, and it goes right back to probably the earliest cave art on the walls of Neolithic and Paleolithic caves, and rock art in the Neolithic time. I mean, the manifestation, art is a communicative force that's so powerful it probably even gave birth to language. I mean, when you think about it, the earliest humans probably didn't have a complexity of language. They may have had a free association thing, like Jung theorizes that there was almost like, like you can have a conversation with a dog without saying anything, just by making your face move. And so that human beings could have that. And I saw that one day. I saw two Roma gypsies on the street in Dublin having a conversation on two ends of the road without actually speaking, and they were going like this, just by facial cues and almost like a type of telepathy. So that was probably what we had. And someone might paint a symbol on the wall of a cave representing, say, the sun, a circle with slashes around it. And they say, "What's that?" And they would go, "Sun, sun, 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 sun." It's the sun. And then that's suddenly they have a language developing out of the pictorial thing. So you have this transformational force that's changed them from a sort of a perceptive visual culture to a more the beginning of literature, the beginning of the concept of metaphor. So it's the first metaphor for that shape on the wall is a metaphor for that bright thing in the sky. This creates a new complexity to layers of consciousness, a new depth to how people think. So suddenly, where everything is not black and white and robotic, the beginning of art really begins. Is that sort of conduit to the subconscious. These lower poles of cognition are suddenly fired in and activated. So from that, the development of the early sort of Neolithic cave art, you had ritual developed from that. You had all the other things came out of that. Then the concept of mythology, magic, the whole thing developed from initially probably someone taking a soot off a cave floor, a red ochre, and drawing a shape, and the whole thing of the logos. That this represents this, and from that becomes the conventions and the narratives from which a whole civilization is built. And this is why, if you look at cave art around the world, similar signs appear everywhere. It's like the word for mother is basically the same in every single language. It's the ma sound, maher, mater, this kind of thing. That's where parameter comes from. The measurement, the monthly cycle of the period is the ma, and this kind of thing. And Maya in the creation of the universe within Hindu Vedic philosophy. But the logos becomes the conduit to the lower poles of cognition that then activate the brain into developing new neural pathways and changes in brain plasticity in order through things such as epigenetics. And then you have a different growth in the brain. It can also happen by racial and social trauma, environmental trauma as well. I mean, one of the speculations for the reason why the cortexes on either side of the brain they're not the same length. One is slightly longer than the other. Is because a primitive mind needed to have two forms of observation. We'll say we're at the side of a lake and you're catching a fish with a gaff, a hook, right? Well, you're focused on that, right? But you've also have to have this peripheral awareness in case a bear or a saber-toothed tiger is going to come around on you. And so this is one of the theories why the brain became nonlinear, was to develop out of that. And this neural plasticity was directly caused by art. And this is the initial art created our whole, the brain that we have now, or the full complexity of it. So this brings us back to what we said at the beginning, how the underlying consciousness, as that develops, it changes the plasticity of the neural pathways, creates new synapses and new partitions within the brain, or activates them in a different way. And this is epigenetics is a fascinating subject of the brain. You basically create the brain you want for your thoughts. So this concept of art creating reality, it's very, very deep, because one, it creates a reality that's based purely on a neurological conditioning of the brain in order for it to become better tuned to a dialogue with the internal poles thing. Who knows? Maybe the daemon invented that in order for our conscious mind to interact with our subconscious mind. We're opening a colossal kettle of fish here, but it's one that has the profundity of that is remarkable. Now, we're talking earlier on about scientists who don't believe in magic and things like this, but if you look at all the greatest scientific, nearly all of them, there were individuals who had the eureka moment. This guy on his bicycle, someone having a bath, suddenly, bam. And that's the history of the modern science. Now, the same thing also happened in art. Mozart just said that the music was already there. It just came out of him, and so on. And there's one, and he was a very spiritual guy and stuff like that. And there's in this part of Ireland, there's a tradition called fairy music. In fact, most of the folk music of Sligo is called fairy music. And it derives from people saying that they heard the fairies playing these jigs and reels. And they'd be out in the woods one day or out in the countryside having a walk around, and suddenly they'd hear, and they'd hear this in their head, and they'd go back home and they'd say, I heard the fairies play this piece of music. And then he would take out the uilleann pipes or the thin whistle, and he would replicate what he heard. And now the music from the fairy world would be very similar to the concept of Mozart hearing it from the flowing stream that passes through him. And there's tremendous academic works on this that are kind of difficult to read, but they're also fascinating to dive into them. Like there's a constant theme in classical mythology regarding artists that they were shepherd boys, and they were minding the flock in the fields one day, and they're discovered by somebody. And this is the story of Giotto and all the great sculptures of they didn't have academic training in how to be the phenomenal architect. I think Brunelleschi was one of them as well. They didn't have this phenomenal, and so was Jack Parsons. He had no background in rocketry, and someone found them, the shepherd boy, and gave them an apprenticeship. And that's probably what happened with Von Karman and Jack Parsons at Caltech. Gave them an apprenticeship, and this apprenticeship allowed them to take their gifts. They were shepherds of consciousness, unresolved, unmanifested aspects of the lower poles of consciousness, and they shepherd them into reality as their creative expressions. That's probably the best way I'd put it.
That was quite intriguing and fascinating, because, with my own writings on the concept of the daemon and the concept of creativity and where it comes from. And clearly the things you were saying there have, triggering so many interesting ideas in my mind as to where we could take this conversation. But I know from the chat room and people like Lehman Dollins and Rose Gomez as well are very interested in your take on Darkstar and on David Bowie. Now, this is particularly fascinating because Sarah recently posted a series of images from, I think it's Pet Level, isn't it? Or Pet Beach, or in Sussex. And this is where Ashes to Ashes was filmed as well. So there's a nice circularity here. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I bought that album when it first came out, and it has always intrigued me. The symbolism in there is incredibly powerful. And I don't know enough about Bowie to know what he was trying to do with that, but clearly he knew he was dying. And clearly he was trying to get such symbolism, like the opening lines of Dark Star. You know, what is it all about?
Well, I've had a long, connection on a sort of psychic level to Bowie. The first record I ever bought was Life on Mars on Abbey Street in Dublin when I was like a grotty record shop when I was 9. And it was, it's just a fascination with the guy that, that he's always seemed to have been there. I never really knew much about him on a kind of like the mystique level, but there was always something that he was beyond reality. It was like he wasn't like any other pop stars. Even though when he saw him interviewed and stuff, he came across a very regular guy. There was something else going on there. It was hard to explain. As a kid, you couldn't really, verbalize it. Even when you're growing up, you just enjoy the records, but you knew there was something else going on there. And when Black Star happened, some friends of mine who were real big Bowie fans came into my studio one day and said, "Thomas, you have to see this." And it was the video for Black Star, and they showed it to me on the iPhone. And immediately I knew that we had stepped into something special here. That the Bowie of Space Oddity, and Lodger and Station to Station, the classic Bowie, Scary Monsters. That he was back, he'd returned, but no, suddenly. And I says, why is Bowie suddenly amazing again? The song is amazing, the video is remarkable, and what's going on here? And then suddenly we find out he died. And I started looking at the video again. Now, Bowie was a great believer. Bowie was an occultist himself at one point. A lot of people don't know this. In the early, well, actually going right back to the Space Oddity era, that all started from standing. He used to take LSD and sit on the roof of his flat in Brixton and hold a UHF TV antenna aerial to the sky to try and hear aliens. Not the worst idea in the world. Well, it could be dangerously pretentious, but not the most incomprehensible idea in the world. But that Space Oddity and Major Tom, his avatar, along with all his other avatars, Aladdin Sane, all came out of that kind of Bowie the man, Bowie the sort of like resolved demons, whatever you want to call it, And so when I saw the Black Star thing, I started to, when Bowie was in LA in the early 70s, he was when he first made it, mid 70s. He first made it as a big star. He was big into Crowley rituals and Crowley and magic, and he had summoned a water demon in his swimming pool in Hollywood, and they couldn't get rid of it. And he had to get like the local witches and stuff in Hollywood to actually put the demon back to the abyss. That could be another tangent of the true origin of the Loch Ness monster, but we won't go there now. But the monster was potentially put to sleep, and if Bowie basically moved away from magic after that point and got into, also he had a big drug problem as well. It's not a good idea to be into magic and drugs. And so Bowie practiced a method called cut-ups. Now, cut-ups was a form of magic invented by William S. Burroughs. And basically what it basically is you would write out lines that would come to your head, like the house is black, this is the world, I hate chocolate eggs, blah, 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 blah. And then you cut them up into you cut the words up and you shuffle them around. And this stuff works, believe me, I've had tremendous success with this. And then you rearrange them, a combination of where they fall and a combination of where they look right. And eventually you get, in his case, the lyrics to a song. And when you do it yourself and you look back on it, what you're doing is you say this. The initial thing is, "Wow, I predicted the future here." No, you didn't. You actually made it. And the cut up things is very interesting. It's like you take your immediate conscious thought, you write it down, you demolish it into its sum of its parts, and then you allow a combination of fate and the lower poles of cognition to reassemble it into something different. So essentially you've taken something and you've hacked reality in real time in front of you. So you've torn a hole in reality almost immediately, because you didn't go with the initial creative function. You destroyed it and you rebuild it again as something else. And that's a very central thing in Freemasonry, to gather up that which has been scattered. And so Bowie was, there's a video you can see somewhere where Bowie's doing cut-ups. It was a BBC documentary from the 70s, and he showed him doing the cut-ups and how he writes lyrics that way. And the video for Black Star is very much a series of cut-ups. Now, whether it was deliberate, whether it was accidental or passive, whether he had a lot of say in it, but when you look at that video, what you see is 2020, 2021, the whole coronavirus thing there. You have Major Tom dying. Right? He's dead. He's on the planet. There's a kind of a tiara on his head that's taken by a girl. And in the background is the black sun with the corona around it. That's the first thing you see, the corona around the sun. And then he's in a room with people who are masked up and blindfolded and shaking in terror, as if, like so many people were during the initial lockdowns. They were locked at home, terrified. And there they are in the room, and he's almost like this kind of preacher around them. And it's, there's another thing where they have like, we had all these awful TikTok dancing things where the nurses were all dancing. That's shown in the video of women in a ritual kind of dancing, and like one of the TikTok videos we saw of the nurses that were bombarded, these stupid things they were bombarded with. There's a guy on a crucifix who's got a full face mask on him. The head of Major Tom is in a case. It's venerated in the same way the vaccine has been venerated, and she brings it into the city at the end to kind of bring the people together. It's you could not have come up with a more powerful allegory of what we've experienced during the cold corona experience. It's all there. It happened probably because of a cut-up. They probably said, let's make this video with all the certain imagery, certain symbols, and then they went into the studio and they chopped this looks better here, that looks better there, that looks better, let's put the girl at the end, let's put that. And what you got was a cut-up that generated the reality of a man dying of cancer. Okay. Now, I often imagine that the moment of death is probably the most powerful moment of all. That transformative moment in leading up to death, if you process that properly, must be the most incredible unleashing of psychic energy possible, especially if you're an artistic force. And knowing that his time was up, and all these other things, that his will was, you want to talk about it, it was a thermonuclear stream of energy. So any kind of creative insight that came into his head was going to be the Mac Daddy of all creative insights. And whether that video created 2021, I don't know right until we are now, but it's all there, from the corona at the beginning to everything, the sanctification of this object that brings hope back to people, the ones who don't want to break from the lockdown, who are very happy. There's a weird phenomenon with the whole lockdown. There are people in Ireland here, I don't know where you are, who are loving this. They've never been happier. They want to stay locked down forever. And that's what the ones on the crucifix are. They're gyrating because they don't want to leave this world of strict rules because it suits them perfectly and so on. They know exactly what they're to do. And so Black Star, only in the last six or 7 weeks did I realize, oh my God, that's what that was. It's a cut-up. And there's even more things you can look at that video and see that it comes to life. There's a very kind of Lovecraftian element to it. There's this weird kind of octopus man thing. And the octopus, I've been talking about that a lot in the last couple of years, is the power animal totem of the age. And a couple of years ago, I said, watch out, octopuses are going to become really big. And now everyone's talking about the octopus now and how intelligent and smart it is. And this is kind of like Lovecraft's world is coming into reality. And this kind of thing. And it's like everything, it was even like, okay, I know I'm extrapolating my view of the world into that video, but I tell you what, even if it's just my view of the world into that video, my God, it was a bullseye, and that to me, that's not an accident.
Yeah, well, one of the things I found when I first saw it, I mean, I used to love Bowie when I was younger, from one of the first singles I ever bought was Space Oddity. And I loved the B-side of that, the wide-eyed boy from Free Cloud. And at that time, I was really intrigued by his symbolism and everything else as well. And I then followed his career in terms of films, The Man Who Fell to Earth, and the strange kind of disassociation you had in that movie. I think probably one of the most disturbing movies ever made in many ways was that. But when I then lost touch with his work, although I'm rediscovering it now, when he was the Thin White Duke and everything else as well. But it was Black Star that really, really brought it back to me. And when I saw that video and the other associated videos as well, and I thought, this is extraordinary. There is so much in this, you know, and ordinarily you look at videos and you think, well, people throw them together because, you know, they're artists and they're throwing ideas together. But there was something deeper and more powerful in that. And I think that was what particularly interested me about it. And the other track, you know, Lazarus, you know, what is all that about, you know?
Yeah, this kind of biography of his life at the moment of death, you know, like the flashback, you know, anyone who tells you they nearly drowned, they'll tell you they saw the life pass in front of their eyes. He did it in, I mean, I know it sounds kind of weird, but I think he actually Bowie became a god at that, before his death. And I mean that literally in the kind of the pagan, the pre-Christian pagan sense, that if your deeds and your creativity is powerful enough in this reality, you literally become a god, an apotheosis. And that's what happened. That's what happened. Bowie was preparing himself for godhood. I can tell you one thing, I don't feel he's dead. You know, it's like, you know, I feel like he's still here on this earth. I don't feel like he died. And that's because he attained godhood instantaneously. And he would have seen like what happened to people like Mark Boland, who attained godhood through an accident. You know, he died tragically, but he never grew old, and he would have been aware of that. And then he would have been aware of other people who died under terrible circumstances, like Freddie Mercury, other friend of his, who didn't get the godhood thing right away. It took a while for that. In fact, only up until recent years for that to really find fruition. And he was aware of the whole Crowley thing of every man and woman is a star. And he was going to make his black star shine within his lifetime. And this is why he's recorded numerous records there to be released, you know, posthumously and so on. This is a man who is very well aware of what human life is really about, and that there's an element, you know, it's a throwback to the ancient pagan times. You know, it's very different to put our modern consciousness into what it was like back in the pagan world. But people didn't live to get into heaven. They lived to become gods themselves. And either through, like Julius Caesar being the classic example, you know, a famous one, but it would have happened all through the Indo-European pagan world is full of this kind of thing. You have, like in the Vedas, you have the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna, and it's basically Arjuna, how do I become a god? Really, that's what he's asking. And we don't have that in the Christian, the post, you know, Constantine, Augustinian theological world. But Bowie was that. He was ensuring his godhood at the end, and that's why I think it hit people so hard. But also there wasn't a great mourning. There was no such thing like, oh, let's put a concert together for Bowie and let's have all these idiots who knew nothing about his music or are currently famous, you know, pretending that they were his lifelong influence, you know. And I remember they initially announced one, and I was like, you know, who wants to, you know, Coldplay is excruciating enough on its own. I wouldn't want to see them doing a Bowie number, you know. And it was just like, no, please go away, you know, go away, you know. And that's just literally was people's attitude towards it. He doesn't need your help. He's doing it himself.
I think the term apotheosis, which again, I'm delighted to hear a wonderful word like this used in an interview. And I was just thinking then, I wasn't expecting that in an interview, nor was I expecting references to Giotto. But then again, it's exactly what I expect always from you, Thomas, because that's how it works. You seem to be an informational sponge, and you take it in and you process it and come out with something completely new. And I always knew that this interview would be extraordinary, and it is proving to be extraordinary beyond words already. And I know from the activity in the chat room, you know, people are really fascinated about the deep, deep wisdom that you're putting forward here, which is intriguing in many, many ways. So let's move back. One of the things that we're both interested in my last book, The Hidden Universe, it's something I really, and it does seem to me that we are moving, you and I are both moving along the same channel, the same themes that are interesting us at both the same time. Because I'm particularly interested in the role of beings, what I call the egregorials, the mind-created entities that use our anticipations of them to come in. In one of my new book, I'm going to be coming up with the term the egregorion. which is a subatomic particle that's created by the anticipation of people and then becomes independent of them, almost like a tulpa in some way. And the thing is, moving on to this, in terms of the interdimensional beings themselves, you know, we know within Irish mythology, we know within Celtic mythology, and both mythologies, there are these entities that can come through, that can be manipulated and will manipulate you ultimately. And we know from people like Dee and Kelly and everybody else, they were all trying to create, as was Crowley, you know, and as you say with the Moonchild, they were trying to create beings to bring them into this reality. So what do you think is the ideas behind them, and what relevance do they have to the modern world? Are they something that's now archaic and part of our past, or is it something you think that's still an integral part of the world that we exist in now?
Well, it's another vast area of complexity, and it's also culturally specific in many ways. And all I know is that they exist, for sure. That I know they exist.
Why is that? Why is that?
Well, because I've experienced it. I've seen them.
Okay, tell us more.
I've done, I've done the work out of Simon's Necronomicon, and this black cloud appeared in the living room, and my bookshelf jumped off the wall and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I've had numerous experiences like this all my life. I wanted to see a UFO once, and I thought, I'll probably never see a UFO in my life. And then one day I'm packing up the car, and there's a thing shaped like a giant tic tac moving across the sky really slowly. So it's like, again, I don't know what they are, but they do exist. Now, the relationship with human beings, well, I mean, I know what they are, but I don't know. I couldn't say, like, oh, I have the answer. This is what they are. It's because of the complexity. You talk about the Irish folklore thing. Well, in Irish mythology, fairies are indistinguishable from demons. The Irish are terrified of the fairies. This is a very different thing than you have, say, in England, where you have the fae. This is where we have the cultural thing involved in it. In Irish fairy folklore, you have the Sidhe, Sidhe, and there's a terror of them. They're not like the sort of like Victorian airy fairy or the Disney Tinkerbell type things. They're seen as a very dangerous, malevolent, other form of consciousness that exists in a reality just outside this one, which we call fairy world. And people accidentally go into fairy world, and the descriptions are very similar to UFO abductions, and very, very almost identical. In fact, I believe that I met Travis Walton, who from wrote Fire in the Sky in Texas a few years ago, and I sat him down and I said, "You had a fairy abduction, you like this kind of thing." And he was a lovely man and everything. He says, "Yeah, it's the same thing, exactly." And I went through all these famous abduction stories of and people I know that were actually farmers around here had those experiences. Now, the thing is, the connection to the art is interesting too as well. I spoke with the fairy music earlier on. There's a fairy in Ireland called the Leannan Sidhe. Now, the Leannan Sidhe is a muse of an artist, and she's like a groupie, and she'd be this like stunning, gorgeous woman, and always have long black hair and blue eyes, which you actually see a lot of these in the west of Ireland, around Galway City. You'll see these like really beautiful girls with snow white skin, jet black hair, and blue eyes. It's a very weird thing. It's like when you'll see them walking down the street, and you'll think she's a goth or something. No, that's how nature made her, and that's it's like remarkable, really. But they do exist, and they're described like that, and they become the muse of an artist, a poet, a songwriter, a musician, a painter, an actor, and his infatuation with her is what generates his immortal art. So his poetry or his paintings or whatever. And but at the same time too, she's a vampire, and she's draining his psychic energy. And to trade off, the Leannan Sidhe gives him the greatest love affair of his life, the greatest muse of his existence, but he'll be dead before he's 30. So it's a bargain. Now, of course, this is mythology, and we're doing these things, and we're using the cultural frameworks. Where in England it wouldn't be the fairies; it'd be demons or something like that, or goblins within English mythology or something like that. In the Nordic world, it'd be something like it, like the Nissa or something like that. And the Wetiko, in the Native American, and the Jinn in the Arabic world, and it goes on and on and on and on. But there seems to be commonalities. Firstly, is there seems to be generally a malevolence against human beings. Not exclusively, but generally. That there's a need to harvest energy from human beings in some way, either through fear. There's a remarkable video of a Scottish gentleman on YouTube, it's called Terrifying Encounter with the Fairies. And he was talking about walking, he's just a regular, he's just seems a nice, ordinary Scottish fella. And he's not like, he's not like one of these bardic types. He's just he could probably lives in Edinburgh or Aberdeen, or he works in the oil industry. But he's walking along one day, and he said he was in the countryside somewhere in Scotland. He heard what he said would sound like Irish music. And suddenly a cloud came over the valley and like an object and flew towards him. And when he looked down at his face, there were two like people dressed in black, like small people, and they were trying to harvest his shadow using a knife. And that's one most, and that's most terrible. They were stealing his shadow, and that's like one of the most terrifying things I've ever heard in my life. They were interested in his shadow, that was cast by the sun, and you find it on YouTube, yeah, and he's very convincing, the guy, and this is they always seem to be after things like this, but they have, and the reason why they're useful to magicians and to a lesser extent shamans, but mainly to workers of magic, is because they don't live in this space-time reality. They can get information from the future. So you have in the cunning men, the cunning folk in England around the time of the Restoration and Cromwell, and after that, they were employed to find things about the future. So they would capture a demon, usually Oberon, the king of the fairies. Again, this is the link, demons, fairies, and they would tell them where you'd lost stuff, they could find it for you. If things were about to happen, they would tell you. And because they were not stuck in the same space-time paradigm we are, they moved at a different speed. And that's why we don't see them. And I mean, even that lyric in the Led Zeppelin song, Stairway to Heaven, if there's a bristle in your hedgerow, that's a fairy is moving through, on a windless day, and your hedgerow goes like that's the fairies moving through it. And you capture one, you get stuff about the future. Now, there's been some interesting work done in recent times by some maverick psychiatrists who've claimed that people who have schizophrenia actually have demons living inside them. And how they've discovered this is these guys would be set free from the psychiatric hospital and suddenly have loads of money. And they'd say, "Where'd you get the money?" And they say, "Well, I knew a place where there was lots of drug money buried from. A drug dealer had buried thousands of dollars. And I went and dug it up." How did you know that? Well, that's what the cunning folk did. They would find a demon, and they would find lost hidden things or future stuff, and this kind of thing, because they're outside this space-time reality. And that's a constant. That's a constant, whether it be in the jinn of the Middle East or the fairies of Ireland, that they're not in this space-time. You have the thing called the fairy stray, which is exactly like the missing time thing and the UFO abduction thing, where someone's walking down the road one day, it suddenly looks different. This doesn't look like where I normally live. And then they come back and they find that 7 hours have passed and they've only feel like they've been walking 3 minutes. That's called the fairy stray. They've strayed in the fairy world. And so it's because it's a different time frame. There's Irish poetry like William Butler Yeats is full of this stuff. The play The Land of the Heart's Desire is about a bride getting married, and the fairy girl jumps in and at the wedding, and she's this wild fairy girl, and she tells to the bride, "You'll never die, you'll live forever in fairyland. What would you rather have, a happy husband and a happy life, or would you rather live with the fairies?" And she runs away with the fairies. And people used to live because it guaranteed immortality and freedom. And there's a pivotal character, I think his name is Father O'Hara, I think, and he's trying to stop her from going into fairyland, but he represents the organized religion because they have no power over the other entities. So it's a very powerful allegorical play. And there's loads of stories like that. The stolen child, the kid who's stolen, abducted by the fairies and is brought back as a changeling, or has been switched and has a different personality. And these things were taken very seriously and even to this day, I'll meet young people around here that like in every other way are modern. And if there's somebody building a new road extension and they say that a fairy tree is being knocked down, they will be writing letters to the paper saying, you cannot knock that down because it is fairy tree. There'll be accents on the site. And these are people who are not there. They could be like IT engineers, but for some reason, Ireland and Iceland, there's still a belief in these things for some reason in the rural areas now. And even like, I know, here's a funny one. I know a guy who's an atheist who wrote to the National Roads Authority, complained that they couldn't put an extension on a roundabout because it would knock over a fairy tree. And his rationale was, well, it's a cultural thing, and we must preserve a local cultural artifact. But deep down inside is because he knew what his grandmother told him had some truth to it.
And on that, one of the things that has long intrigued me in my own reading of the occult and reading on ghosts and things is the role of landscape, and the role of landscape within legend, within ideas and everything else as well. It's almost that the landscape itself and stone structures, you know, the stone tape theory, that they can kind of hold these things within them and can send them out again into consensual reality. And I know that, you know, sort of you're probably aware that, you know, my ethnicity is Irish as well. And I remember my Irish relatives talking about this and about the landscape and how important it is in places like Meath and Westmeath, where my family come from. And it's very intriguing, you know, this idea of the world itself is almost recording what's happening and playing it back to us. What would you say about that in your experience again?
I've never experienced that directly, but there are people who can. Psychometrists, they can actually put their hands on an ancient wall and they can somehow, like a tape recorder, pick up on the past. There was a fascinating individual in called John Foster Forbes. He was a Scottish gentleman, and he was this obscure character, and I'm probably the world's #1 expert on him because everyone else hated him except me, and they thought he was a quack, and I was the only one that I started really researching his life big time. And he was brought up on an ancestral manor house in Scotland, and there was a stone circle on the site, and one of his father's aristocratic friends said something like, "Oh, they sacrifice young boys like you on those circles." And he immediately had a terrifying experience. And he started to realize that these stones had memories, and maybe that when he was a little boy, someone killed him there or something, or he witnessed something on these sites. So he devoted his life to a thing called psychometry, where it's a belief that within stones you could actually have contained memories, a stone tape thing, right? Mm-hmm. And he had this. If there was ever a movie made about it, it'd be brilliant, because it'd be like something like what was that famous English train? The Titfield Thunderbolt. There was almost like these characters, these sort of eccentric English country characters. One of them was a woman called Miss Eliza Pixley, who was the human television set, and she could put her hands on, you know, she'd give her a cup of tea and she'd put her hands on a megalith and she could see the past and this kind of thing. But it's almost quite delightful stuff to read. But he took this stuff very seriously, and he said that the stone circle, and as when he was existed in his time, he was considered a whack job, right? But he was the one, you know, he wasn't really, he was just an eccentric. But at the time of World War II, when bombs were raining down on Britain, people had no time for these kind of characters, you know. Staying alive was the main thing, you know, and your family, your husband or your brother off in the war. But he was writing these books and self-publishing them in this period, and to great ridicule. But he was right in so many ways, because through these readings, he said that the megalithic structures of Britain, Ireland, and Iberia were built by the same culture, and are older than the ones in Europe. Now, at the time, that would have been considered guff, because there's always been the east-west migration thing, that the stone circles at the periphery of Europe, in Portugal, Ireland, Shetland, Britain, should be the most recent, because it all expands from out of Babylon, right? Mm-hmm. They're the oldest. The ones in the periphery are the oldest. And he said it was because they're the remnants of Atlantis. And he said the story was that what they had determined was that Atlantis had been destroyed by a technology. Now, you're talking about like 20, 30, 40 years before the whole New Age thing out even gestated slightly, on his own, said that Atlantis was a priest class of druids who had, like their technological class were also a priest class. They were like druids. And they made a mistake with it, and they just damaged reality. They destroyed reality around 2300 BC. And this is a pivotal date because a lot of things happened around that period. The desert in the Sahara became desiccated at that period and dried out. It used to be a forest, and other things like that. Many things happened in that period. Sigiriya started around then, and that's Lemuria, and they said that reality was damaged. There was a damage to reality. Timelines were broken up. It caused all kinds of magnetic problems with the earth, earthquakes, everything. And until they fixed it and restabilized reality. And when they did, it was, that's what happened. The sea levels rose and Atlantis was destroyed. And what was the megaliths around the west of Ireland, Scotland, parts of England, even up to Norway and down in Iberia, are the remnants of Atlantis. And they're much older. Now, this was done decades before they had really good carbon dating. I mean, some of the ones around here, Carrowkeel, not Carrowkeel, the other one, Carrowmore, the megalithic center up here, that was tested by a Swedish research crew, and they discovered it at 13,000 BC, the initial readings. And then the Irish Antiquities turned around and says, go back and get the proper reading. And they settled on 7. But their initial readings they were far, far more ancient than convention said. And that's tied in theory with his. Now, this information was derived from 2 things. He studied he studied artwork on the stones, and he also the psychometry thing. He said the stones had memories. They recorded it like television pictures. And some people have a nervous system that's able to pick up on these. And this is probably what ghosts could be and things like that. Now, let me tell you an experience I had that was terrifying. About 4 years ago, myself, and if you ever speak to Maria Wheatley, she'll confirm this. Maria Wheatley and James Swaggart, we were in Sardinia making a film. And we went to this megalith that was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was literally in the middle of like bandit country on the top of a mountain. And we had a terrible time finding it. GPS wasn't working properly, but we did find it in the end. And we found this kind of what they call the giant's grave, these neurologic things. And this one, I don't think, I'm the only one that has photographs of, I think, we 3 of us. It was that remote. We were literally hiking up a mountain, and I was in a great form. It was like, I'm in Sardinia. I've never been on the mountain, so I was enjoying the experience of it all. And I did my filming bit, and then I sat at the back of the megalith. It was like a chambered passageway thing. I sat at the back. I'm sitting there, and I'm just sitting there looking around at the trees, enjoying the birds and the nature and the butterflies. And then suddenly, what felt like a hole was drilled in the bottom of me, and my whole bodily energy started falling out. I could barely get up. And the 2 of them literally had to carry me down the mountain. And one of the things we had done was get over a wall. We climbed over a high dry stone wall, and I could not lift my leg up above the height of my kneecap. And the only way I got through the wall was I said, stand out of the way. And I threw myself on the wall and knocked down a hole in the stone wall. And I had to demolish the wall by throwing myself at it. I couldn't climb over it. And I was like a human wrecking ball. I had to smash the wall. And we got down the hill, and I was under the most ferocious psychic attack of my life. I had intruded on some force that lived there, maybe disrespected it by sitting on it or something like that. And when we got back into the town, I went to a store and bought 2 bags. And thank God I knew this stuff. 2 bags of sea salt, big bags. Went into a cold bath and just had a cold bath of cold, icy seawater all over me. After a few hours, I was fine. It was something had energetically, literally ravaged through me in that spot. I don't know if it was the stone memory thing, if there was a memory in there that I picked up on. if there was an entity guarding it and I disrespected it somehow, if there was an entity in the landscape, whatever it was because of the megalithic site, and a very remote one. And that's the thing: the more a site is visited, the less magic it has. If they're left alone, they're almost like batteries. They charge up with a certain type of energy. I've noticed that the remote ones, when you come upon the ones that no one goes to, they have a special power about them. Where you go to Stonehenge, yeah, it's fantastic, it's impressive. You don't feel the same. I would say it's almost like a sinister. And there's another one too as well. The stones that have the highest level of this have the highest amount of quartz streams. Quartz. Now, quartz is a very interesting mineral. It's layered in such a way that it can actually, the different layers create an actual charge. This is why it's used in crystal radios.
Yeah, piezoelectricity.
Exactly, and that's why it's used in the occult a lot. This is why when people tell me they feel like they're being attacked by entities, I say cold salt baths, sea salt, and fill your house full of as much pieces of quartz as you can find. It disrupts any pathological energy that's coming into your home. Now that's salt, and the seawater salt is good as well. It has a similar electrical aspect. It's an electrical thing because it's damaging your nervous system. It's affecting your nervous system. So anyway, these quartz streams are very interesting. Now, in a lot of the megaliths in Ireland, especially around here, the ones that have the highest levels of quartz on them are the ones that are associated with traveling or communicating with this fairy world. The quartz crystal radio was initially designed by our ancestors to communicate with the other side, to bring the fairies through to us or us through to them. And you will find this as quartz streams are predominant. And this one I sat on had a big ass quartz stream at the back. So it was that aspect of it. So we know that quartz can produce an electric charge. We know that it vibrates at a very specific level. That's why it's used in watches and every electronic equipment. It can pick up and transmit radio signals. We know that for a fact. But it also has a thing called diamagnetic energy. Now, this is, I don't know how long we have, but diamagnetic energy is, it's not like electromagnetic energy. It's a different type of energy that's stored almost like a static electricity. But the one effect it does have is it grounds itself. Okay, so it can be earthed, like, you talk about you earth an electrical circuit or you ground an electrical circuit. That's it can be dissipated into the earth. The Irish round towers, those famous round towers all around Ireland. There was an American scientist called Callahan, Philip S. Callahan. He was an American scientist working in the US military, and he was in Ireland during World War II, in Northern Ireland. In Southern Ireland was neutral. And when the war ended, he had nothing to do after D-Day. He basically invented the communication system that was used in D-Day by the Americans. And he had nothing to do. So him and his friends started going around Ireland visiting megaliths. And using his scientific equipment, started measuring them. And he discovered that the round towers of Ireland were not turrets. They were some kind of diamagnetic accumulator. And he wrote a book about the magnetic life of agriculture. And he said that these round towers were following on from an ancient form of technology that the megalith builders had, where the energy was taken from the surrounding environment and put into the soil, and it conditions the soil. So that, and Irish farmers will tell you to this day, if they have a round tower on their land, they will bring the cows to it because they'll have higher milk yields and will be less prone to disease. And that goes on to this day. And he demonstrated it with actual tests. Now, there's lots of quartz stones there's a whole other story about them. Again, that's another thing. This is so he theorized through science that these stones had some kind of ability to transmit it to our ancestors. Use me. And so the stones were able to tell them that they had diamagnetic energy. So our ancient ancestors were able to build megaliths for two purposes. One, communicating with the spirit world, and also learning engineering and all that kind of thing, logos that we talked about earlier on, and also to agriculture. Now, you look at the south of England. Do you ever look at the topsoil around where Stonehenge is? It's like nothing. It's on a chalk layer. That's the breadbasket of England. All around there is where all the crops are all grown. And there's Stonehenge right in the middle of it. And yet no one seems to put one and one together there. And there's also massive aquifers under the ground. There's a connection with water as well. So our ancestors had a technology that was very different than what we have today, but it was still a high technology. It just functioned in a different way. And these things with communication with the spirit world and so on, while yes, it's probably true on some level, but it was also a powerful allegorical methodology of doing it. So for instance, in modern science, you say, okay, I want to make that field over there more fertile. Okay, well, we start putting down fertilizer, we start potassium and potash, and well, they would have said something like, well, the fairies can make us do it, help us. If we put a stone with all the white quartz in it in the field, and we sit around it, and we think about it, and we process it, and we venerate it at certain rituals at certain points of the year, the fairies will take their energy and then feed it into the field. Now, we now know that the magnetic energy, through the work of Philip S. Callahan, actually conditions the soil to make yields better and make plants disease resistant, as well as help livestock. But they wouldn't have sat down and said, let's get out our computers and let's talk about do calculations. It was just the powerful thing of magic now. They used metaphor, allegory, and mythology as the scientific language in order to bring it to manifestation. It wasn't technical, it wasn't engineering. That didn't matter. It still worked.
That is extraordinary for many reasons, because one of the strangest experiences I think I've ever had in my life took place at Glendalough in the Wicklow Mountains. And in Glendalough, there is a round tower. And I do recall having this very strange sensation there of something deeper in some way. And then I'm reminded of, we were talking about piezoelectricity and talking about the way in which quartz works. And of course, within the pineal gland of the brain is something called pineal sand. And pineal sand are crystals. And could it be that there is a relationship between the crystals within the pineal gland, and therefore the release maybe of endogenous DMT within the pineal gland in some way or other? There are lots of areas that we can really expand into in terms of ideas. The amount of ideas are just buzzing around in my head at the moment because, you and I really need to talk a lot more. There were so many things I couldn't jot in because I had to allow you to flow, but we really need to have a longer conversation, just you and I, on following through on a lot of these themes that we've discussed here today, because I think we're going along the same route. And I just wonder whether we're going to be coming to the same conclusions in terms of this. So it's quite intriguing. And indeed, a lot of these shows at the moment that are taking place are almost synchronistic in the way the ideas are coming together in the most extraordinary way. And I do strongly advise anybody who hasn't watched any of the previous shows, watch them and then watch this one, or vice versa, because the similarities and the parallels are just really drawing together almost in a kind of a demonic force that's creating this. Now, I'm aware that we're running out of time now. So, Thomas, there were still so many other things I wanted to talk to you about. So yet again, we have to get you back for a future guest, because we've just scraped the surface here. So can you let people know how people can contact you? I know that your YouTube site is phenomenally popular. But check it out and everything else. So how can the guys know more about Thomas Sheridan and what you do, your writing and everything else?
Well, if they go to that address there, Moss Upon Stones, that's my main site now, and all the links are from that. That'll get you at mossuponstones.com. Now, the YouTube channel that I'm mainly working from this point on is Beyond Room 313, but there's playlists in there to all my other channels, my Thomas Sheridan 1 and Thomas Sheridan 2 channels. But this is my main sort. This is where the Jack Parsons documentary is for anyone who wants to watch that. There's also links to the Round Towers documentary. That's also on there too if they want to watch that. And the other stuff that we've been talking about today. But that's basically, I get everything in those two things there. But I would ask people to go and subscribe to Beyond Room 313. It's going to become a major channel. I've got huge plans for it. And I want it to be a real useful archive for people in the knowledge we're talking about here. And so on. And it's a creative archive as well. Jason, who writes the soundtrack for a lot of the films, he puts his music up there as well. So it's a true polymathic place, and that's like what we had today. This has been a polymathic place we've developed here today. Art, music, science, engineering, folklore, everything. It all comes together. And this is what gives us, people like us, a tremendous freedom academia doesn't have. And this is why it's so important that you're making these shows. I think this series what you and Sarah have done, it's the best thing you've ever done in all the years I've been following you. And I think now is the time for us in the alternative scene to make this kind of mark and leave a legacy. I really think it's important.
I think it is, and I think it's down to people like you and I, and like Sarah and all our previous guests as well. I just feel driven that we are creating something extraordinary here in different channels, in different ways, but we're really creating an intellectual alternative. This is not new age wacko stuff. This is highly intellectual. This is highly researched. It's highly thought through. And we're joining the dots. And I am so excited. And all I can say is, Thomas, that this has been an extraordinary 2 hours. I've got so many things I want to think about. So I will be in contact with you within the next few days to really think things through of how we take all this forward. Our daemons need to know what they want us to do with all this, because I think it is extraordinary. Again, thanks very much to Sarah in the background here. Sorry I didn't get the chance to bring you in as regularly as I normally do, but I know that what Thomas has to talk about is so extraordinarily important. It's important that we get him to talk. And again, thanks to everybody else who've been listening in as well. It's been an extraordinary show. And some of the comments in the chat room have been extraordinary and powerful as well. So thank you guys for that. And we'll be live in a few weeks' time again. So thanks again to everybody for joining in, and our apologies for the slightly strange start, but we've actually got more material now than we anticipated. So thanks very much, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.